Symonette, Symonette versus State, found at 180 Southern 3rd. I'm sorry, it's 100 Southern 3rd, 180, 4th DCA 2012. And State versus Lamarck, Lumarque, at 44 Southern 3rd, 171, 3rd DCA 2010. And the case provided by the State, Ducas, DUCAS versus State, 37 Florida Law Weekly, D823, April 11th, 2012. First of all, I'm going to go ahead and provide the ruling on the animation. The State's objection to the admissibility and evidence to the computer animation is sustained. The computer animation will not be introduced into evidence, but it may be used by the defense as a demonstrative exhibit. Based upon this ruling, the court does not need to do a Daubert analysis. In regards to Mr. Connor, the defense is seeking to admit information from Mr. Martin's phone through Mr. Connor pursuant to 90.803 subsection 3. The court finds that that subsection does not apply. The State's objection to the admissibility of the evidence from Mr. Martin's phone is sustained. At this time, Mr. Zimmerman, I need to advise you of some rights that you have. If you'd please stand for just one moment. In any criminal trial, you have the right to remain silent. That means during this trial, you do not have to say anything, do anything, or prove anything. You understand that?
Yes, Your Honor.
You also have the right to testify if you want to. And that's a decision that you alone have to make. I mean, the final decision is yours, but I want you to make sure that you're having conversations with your attorneys about whether or not you're going to testify. And I'm going to ask you again later whether or not you've had those discussions. I don't need to know what you talked about, but just that you had the discussions, and then if you have made up your mind, and I'll ask you some questions about that, okay? So you'll be thinking about that now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you, sir.
One matter, reference the text messages, please. 90.803 was not the only basis that admissibility was sought, specifically citing Chambers v. Mississippi, and the notion that it is relevant evidence, and there is no hearsay objection that could trump, if you will, the Constitution when such probative, relevant, powerful evidence is offered by the defense. So the court hasn't addressed that.
Okay. Well, I'll address it now. The court had made a pretrial ruling about the admissibility of that evidence, so that ruling stands, as does the ruling today, even in light of Chambers. Okay. Is the defense ready to call your next witness? We'll have the jury come in.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, please. I'm sorry. Okay. Is the State ready for the jury to come in?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Let's bring the jury in. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. As you're getting ready, I'm going to ask you my questions, and if your answer is yes to any of the questions, please raise your hand. During the overnight recess, did any of you have any discussions amongst yourselves or with anybody else about the case? No hands are being raised. Did any of you read or listen to any radio, television, or newspaper reports about the case? No hands are being raised. Did any of you read or create any emails, text messages, tweets, blogs, social networking pages about the case? Did any of you use any type of an electronic device to get on the internet to do independent research about the case, people, places, things, or terminology? Okay, thank you very much. And Juror E6, if you need to leave the courtroom, just raise your hand and we'll allow you to do that. We'll take a recess. Okay, thank you. With that, Mr. O'Mara, if you'll call your next witness.
Defense would call Dennis Root, R-O-O-T.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that your testimony in these proceedings will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
May inquire.
Thank you. Morning, sir.
Good morning.
State your name, please.
Dennis Root,
Could you spell your last name?
R-O-O-T as in Tom.
And tell the jury, if you would, your occupation.
I'm currently self-employed as a safety and law enforcement trainer and also as a private investigator and expert witness.
Okay. And it is that purpose that brings you here today, correct?
Yes.
What I'd like you to do, if you would, is to begin, I guess, at the beginning and tell us how you first got involved in law enforcement generally, and we'll sort of walk you through the steps of your career.
Okay, in April of 2011, I retired after completing just over 22 years of law enforcement service. I began my law enforcement career with the City of Riviera Beach. While employed there, I performed duties primarily for road patrol. I was also offered the opportunity to obtain an instructor certification for defensive tactics, which is the lead instructor's position for force-related hand-to-hand type training. I went to subsequent training courses for OC, which is a pepper spray training, and also impact weapons. And I managed to become the lead instructor for defensive tactics with the City of Riviera Beach while I was employed there.
And so if I might, I know some of the terms from having spoken to you before and my experience doing this, but I want to make sure that that the jury understands when we use terms like impact weapons. So
Oh, sure.
if you could, as you go through it, I may interrupt you once or twice more along the way, but if you can advise the jury what you mean and sort of the science behind impact weapons.
Sure. For the impact weapons, we're talking about the batons. Anything from a side handle baton to what's most commonly carried now, which is an expandable or collapsible baton, the ASP type baton. And they range from anything from a metal baton to wooden baton. So impact weapon is geared toward those weapon systems designed specifically for striking and blocking purposes.
And are there particular ways to actually use those weapons as opposed to just striking somebody with it? Or how does a layperson know the basis for your training and how to use a weapon like that?
For an impact weapon, for all the weapon systems in law enforcement, there are what they call basic operator certification courses that are taught to law enforcement professionals. These courses are designed to teach them the laws surrounding the use of the weapon system. They're designed to educate them on how to carry, present, and also utilize, whether it's striking or blocking, or some of the weapon systems and some of the techniques that they teach can be used for takedowns and things like that. The idea behind the basic operator certification is to educate the operator on target areas, what you can expect injury-wise from a variety of target areas, strikes to muscle mass versus connective tissue versus what we would call deadly force or final targets, which would result in great bodily harm or death. So the education course, the basic operator course, is designed to educate the operator through a minimum of usually about a 4-hour class on how to properly utilize the weapon for defensive and offensive needs.
Okay. And I think that you had said that you had gotten a level of proficiency in that allowed you to train other officers?
Yes. Became an instructor, then I eventually became an instructor trainer, and after completing my career in law enforcement, I designed and implemented also an instructor level course that I've taught throughout the state of Florida and various other states in the United States, where I now teach the instructor of the instructors. I do what they call a master level trainer, where I do the instructor's course so that the instructors can go out and teach other trainers.
I'm going to try and keep this chronological and then identify what certifications you got along the way. So you were speaking to us now about your initial law enforcement career beginning with Riviera Beach.
Yes, sir.
What else did you learn, or what other proficiencies did you acquire during that work?
While there, like I said, I became a defensive tactics instructor. I went to the required state course for gaining certification to teach open hand control techniques, striking, blocking, takedowns, arm locks, things like that. I also became an instructor for pepper sprays. Pepper spray, again, just similar to impact weapons, has a basic operator certification course, and I went to the trainer's course to teach the basic course. That course involves proper deployment, target areas, and so forth. In a similar nature as you do with the impact weapons, it's just a lower level on the force continuum that's evaluated by those being either using it or evaluating its use. So my instructor certifications while at the City of Riviera Beach were the initial instructor level courses.
You had mentioned a term that I presume is going to come up in your future testimony here today, so I want to ask you to explain it to the jury. A concept of a force continuum. Explain to the jury what that is.
It's basically, a force continuum is a systematic approach to the escalation and de-escalation of force options. It's basically looking at an event and saying that all events start, for example, with somebody being present. So that would be one of the first things that you would look for as you begin your evaluation. Who was there, how many were there, so on and so forth. You evaluate each and every level, and you have to break it down for both the aggressor, and you have to break it down, in law enforcement terms, it's the aggressor or your subject and the officer. In civilian terms, it would be the aggressor and the defender. Okay, and what you do is you look at the various levels of options that are available to that individual, taking into consideration a wide variety of topics, ranging from personal information, subject factors like their age, their height, their weight, things like that, moving through background, training, experience, weapon availability, environment considerations. All these things come into a force continuum, which is a structured way of saying that if I were to do A, you would be permitted to do B. And it's a structured system that allows to evaluate where the one person is on a force level in comparison to where the other person is permitted to be, or is what they really term to be accepted to be at.
And is that then information that you both learned as a law enforcement officer and now teach?
Yes. It started, the first time you take a force course, one of the first topics they go over is the law and the force continuums, because without a thorough understanding of how and when you can do something, there's no need to move any farther into weapon systems and what you could utilize for that. So it's a really basic foundation that everything else comes from. And when you progress it through law enforcement, the options are quite different because there's so many things in what I call the bat belt. You know, a police officer has gear wrapped around them from pepper spray, tasers, impact weapons, firearms. The average person doesn't. So the continuum, even though it can be taken down and looked at through other perspectives, legal means and so forth for an individual, the essence of the continuum remains the same. It's just the availability of options changes.
And was this something, where does this training begin? Is this what you learn as a rookie, they call it, or a plebe, somebody in the academy? Or?
The training on force begins in the police academy. It's one of what they call high liability courses that an officer must demonstrate proficiency in order to obtain and be able to test to obtain their law enforcement certification. So it is one of the key base building blocks that starts in the police academy and never ends. Law enforcement agencies everywhere are required to maintain an ongoing level of training on all the various weapon systems as well as communications, because that's also considered a component of use of force. Though all the things that an officer could utilize during their career, they have to maintain a level of proficiency, and that training never ends until the day that they walk out of their career.
And we were now talking in our timeline about your work at Riviera Beach. You've talked now about some of the certifications, if you would continue with those.
The other certifications that I went to, I was very into traffic. So in Riviera, I became basically the on-shift traffic unit. We had a small shift and we didn't have an active traffic unit. And I became involved with teaching DUI as well. So one of my other certifications, I became certified with DUI stops and things, and actually created a training program for the City of Riviera Beach that was approved through the state attorney's office on how to conduct a DUI investigation and how to properly document it throughout the entire DUI process.
How long were you with Riviera Beach?
Total, about 5 years.
And any other specialties or training focuses that you had with Riviera besides those that you've mentioned so far?
The only other things that really became certifications is while I was there, I did attend conferences geared toward defensive tactics. When I took my first instructor certification course in defensive tactics, I kind of fell in love with the topic and knew right then and there that that was something I wanted to do and specialize in for the rest of my career, if not longer. And I went and became an instructor for various techniques like vascular restraints. A lot of people call them chokeholds. They're not really chokeholds, but for layman terms, the police applied chokehold, for lack of better terms. Also in control points, which are the pressure points on the human body. I became a certified instructor with that. And I also became a certified instructor in, at the time it was called ink pen knife defenses. And what that was, the most common thing a police officer has on their person is an ink pen. And when confronted with an adversary, if you were utilizing your pen, it's a way to utilize the ink pen in defensive measures against somebody that may have a knife or other edged object, and you are not able to transition to your firearm. It was techniques to utilize that to defend yourself.
Now moving forward from Riviera Beach, first, any other certifications we haven't talked about yet during that first sort of chapter of your career?
No, that was pretty much it there.
And if I might, I'm going to have something more, if I might, Ron. Have you provided to us what we commonly know as a resume or a CV documenting some of this information?
Yes.
Would it be helpful to have this available to you as we go through your testimony?
It could. I mean, if there was something I didn't know, but I mean, it's my life, so I'm pretty
Okay.
clear on it. Unless you want specific date on an attendance of class, then I would probably have to look at my CV for that.
We have it marked. We'll keep it as that. If you can use your memory, that's fine as well. So let's move forward then from Riviera Beach. Where did you go after that?
The next agency I was with for a very brief period of time was the Jupiter Police Department, where I was assigned again to road patrol duties.
Okay. How long were you there?
That was just under a year. I was there just under a year, and during that time I had the opportunity also to take on a lead role as a defensive tactics instructor. When I was recruited by the city of Jupiter, I started and immediately began being presented with opportunities to bring the skills and things that I had learned from Riviera Beach to the Jupiter Police Department, and I began training with some of their other lead trainers on defensive tactics techniques and various things dealing with defensive tactics.
So in layman's terms then, defensive tactics is how somebody would defend themselves against somebody else.
It's fighting.
It's
Layman's
fighting.
terms it's fighting.
And fighting in a way that minimizes injury to yourself.
Oh, absolutely. The reason it was initially termed defensive tactics is in law enforcement, pretty much when you utilize force, it's in response to another person's actions. So it became defensive in nature. Even though there are taught offensive techniques, the whole goal in law enforcement was you defended yourself, you defended another person, you just didn't walk up and start a fight. That's where the term came from. But the reality of it is you're teaching people how to defend themselves through fighting techniques.
Why such a short period of time at Jupiter PD?
When I started there in Riviera, because it was a very active city, in Riviera Beach, I didn't spend any time on midnights. I actually was pretty much always on 3 to 11s, the afternoon, the evening shift where it was really, really busy. When I went to Jupiter, they had a seniority basis, and you had to be on midnights until you were there long enough that your seniority allowed you to leave that shift. Unfortunately for me, I learned while I was there is I have, for lack of better words, a condition that doesn't allow my body clock to change. So I couldn't adapt to midnights. I literally would sleep an hour and a half to 3 hours tops in a day, and it was really affecting me. So I went to the administration, told them about it. Normally, because you're on probation, they would just terminate you because you can't perform the job the way they want it done. I was blessed that they extended me the opportunity to move immediately to a 4 to 12 shift, which created a lot of strife in my career because there were a lot more senior people ahead of me that should have been given that position, but the administration elected to offer it to me. And because of the conflict that it created, it just seemed like a better idea that other options were presented to me, and I felt that it would be a good idea to follow them.
And just to clear up any concerns anyone may have, was the short duration of your time with Jupiter due to any disciplinary problems, any concerns, or any performance evaluation issues?
None whatsoever.
Then you went from Jupiter to where?
Martin County Sheriff's Office. I took a position as a drill instructor with the Juvenile Offender Training Center, their juvenile boot camp. It was under law enforcement special services, and it was a really unique opportunity to work with kids.
And what do you do during that part of your career?
The time that I was assigned to the Juvenile Offender Training Center, I started as a drill instructor in the boot camp, and because of my background and experience within a short period of time, I was asked to take over the training responsibilities for the program, where I helped develop training programs for ongoing training for new drill instructors and the current staff. Eventually, I was given the responsibility of being the supervisor of what they term the Sanctions Enforcement Unit, which is the equivalent of probation officers. When the young men come in through the system, by the time that they're there after about 6 months, they're released back into the community, where they're monitored by deputies to ensure that they're transitioning, maintaining their curfew, and doing things like that. So it would be equated to as similar as being a probation officer for a juvenile offender. And then I was promoted to the rank of sergeant and ran that unit until I went back to road patrol and pursued other opportunities for me within the sheriff's office.
During the time you were with the sheriff's office, did you accomplish any other certifications or training in particular areas of law enforcement focus?
My focus, I had the opportunity to experience just about everything a police officer can experience while with Martin County. I was within their training unit. I was within their criminal investigations division as a detective. I was in the traffic unit, road patrol. I also served on the K-9 unit. And throughout my time, the entire process, I also was an ancillary instructor, where I would go and take on and do training classes for a variety of topics, mostly dealing with force. I continued my education. I continued going to schools. I also became a master instructor. First became an instructor, and then a master instructor with Taser International, which is the taser weapons, the stun guns. And then I started transitioning and teaching the instructor level courses for that. I also took over when I was in training. I was designated the use of force specialist in the agency, where anytime there was a force event, the information was always forwarded to training. My job was to look at it, evaluate it, see if there were violations of either policy and procedure or training standards. And also I would try to take the experiences of the other deputies who were involved in various issues and see how we could turn them into training opportunities for the deputies that had never experienced it but may benefit from the experience. So throughout the remaining portion of my career, I dedicated most of my time to continuing my training and development of certifications in force-related topics. I got my firearms instructor certification. I also became a tactical shotgun instructor. I continued on and became an instructor trainer with pepper sprays. So I transitioned from where I had the instructor rating up to the instructor class where I could teach the instructor courses. And I continued. I also took on responsibility at the local academy, where I was at first started as an adjunct trainer for the Academy for Corrections and Law Enforcement, teaching defensive tactics. I was lucky enough that my teacher and mentor was stepping down and provided me with the opportunity to step up to what they call the lead instructor's position, which is the person who coordinates and organizes the Law Enforcement and Corrections Academy's defensive tactics programs. In the process, I also obtained my 2-year degree in criminal justice, which enabled me now to start teaching the instructor level classes for the college for like defensive tactics. So I became the instructor that taught the defensive tactics instructor's course.
You had mentioned a moment ago about this becoming a use of force specialist. Is this something that teaches what we talked about a moment before, which was this continuum of force and how and when to use force in a law enforcement situation?
Yes, as the designated use of force specialist for the agency, my job was to develop use of force training. I worked with fantastic instructors for firearms, defensive tactics. I was given the privilege of coordinating a lot of the training that took place, especially if it fell to force of any type, whether it was handcuffing, because I took it upon myself also to go and get schools to become a handcuffing instructor. Not just the ones that come from defensive tactics, but other disciplines and other organizations that offered that type of training, because I was always trying to find a better way to teach our personnel and other people how to stay safe and utilize the weapon systems. throughout my career, continued and went back for, we have regional trainings where I would go to the CJSTC-sponsored annual certification courses for high liability instructors and continue acquiring additional instructor certifications that tapped onto and added to already existing instructor certifications like tactical handgun and shotgun. I also went to NRA courses where I started to attend classes to get NRA certifications for firearms training, and I became a state licensed firearms instructor so that I started teaching armed security courses. I had already been teaching unarmed security training for security officers, but by obtaining the state licensed firearms instructor certification, it enabled me to teach the firearms aspects of security. And I just continued developing training that was eventually geared toward and took over where I was presenting some of the civilian training for the sheriff's office. From one of the most important jobs for law enforcement or any company is the fact of communication. So I took on the responsibility of teaching a program known as verbal judo, which is tactical communication, how to communicate with somebody in a way that's not aggressive. So I also added that to my responsibilities as the force specialist. And I continued to develop the training programs for the sheriff's office. When I was offered other opportunities like going to K-9 and things like that, I worked very closely with the lieutenant of our training unit in continuing to develop training for the agency as a whole.
Not to focus on probably the least significant of the certifications you just discussed, but there are actually proper ways to handcuff people? And
yes, there are techniques because you have to be... Handcuffing somebody is putting restraints on them. You have concerns about that because if you place them on too tightly, it can cause injury to someone. Also, if you don't properly train the individual on how to use restraints, there's what I call the good side and bad side to handcuffs. The good side is the side that actually moves. So when you make contact with a person, it'll ratchet around and actually move. If you use the bad side, make contact, you can cause injury because it's basically two pieces of steel that you're slamming into a wrist, so it can cause injury. So yeah, there are techniques that you should continuously revisit, even as something as small as handcuffing.
okay. You mentioned that as a use of force expert, you would sometimes use opportunities or situations as training exercises. It sounds like good speak for when another officer doesn't do something right, you help retrain them. Was that part of what you did?
Yes and no. I mean, it's not just when they don't do something right, it's also when they do something correctly. When you get a force event in, I get handed paperwork that says, basically, here's what happened. I took it upon myself. I would speak with the officers involved. I would speak with supervisors involved. If we determined something was wrong, then obviously we needed to re-educate that officer on how to do their job properly. But we also use that as an opportunity to make sure everybody else remembers this is the way to do it. But just as important, when an officer was involved in a situation that was just unique, that no one else up to that point had ever been involved in, we take it, we look at it at its face value, and then we try to create a training scenario that we would be able to put other deputies or officers through a similar controlled event so they gain the experience. So it's not just when they do it wrong, it's also when they're doing it right, and we're adapting it to training for the agency as a whole.
And as you then continued your experience as Martin County Sheriff, did you get or continue a focus on those use of force events where you became the go-to person for those?
I was lucky enough that throughout my career, and because of my training background and experience, the agency, the state attorney's office, when there were force events that took place, shootings and things like that, I was the person that I was given the opportunity to evaluate, review, and provide an opinion on it. I also have been contacted by agencies surrounding us as well as across the United States because I've taught at or been with other training programs and have met a lot of people, and I've had the opportunity when they've had something unique or they're developing a policy for the first time, or for example like with the taser weapons when they were brand new, I would get phone calls about making recommendations on how their policy and procedure should be written so that it conforms both with what the manufacturer requires for training programs but also what meets a lawful need given the use of the weapon system. So I had the opportunity to be the person that other agencies and individuals came to, as well as testify to grand juries about officer-involved shootings. I've testified, or I've spoken to other agencies and counseled other personnel on proper documentation as well as techniques for use of force.
Other certifications that we haven't talked about that you've accomplished through your time with Martin County, we've talked about some of the use of force and the particular weapon systems, and you talked about defensive tactics and NRA. Any other particular areas of training or focus that you had during your time with Martin County?
I'm kind of unique because every time I take on a position, I try to find an instructor's course for it, because I was truly in the mindset that if you learn to teach it, you can perform it a little bit better. For example, when I became a canine handler, I was very vested into the position, and then I became a canine team instructor. Each and every weapon system that we had, from a Kubaton to an impact weapon, as far a Kubaton being those little key ring things that you can use for, they're like maybe 6 inches long plastic that you'll see on some people's key rings. Those are little impact weapons, little batons, up through including full-length batons, knife defenses, handguns, long guns. I participated in the training of our agency for rifles. Everything, if it's a weapon system, I had the opportunity to provide training with it. And if it was a weapon system that I was dedicated to, like vascular restraints, or if it was impact, OC, taser, firearm, I went and became an instructor and eventually I currently have 4 courses that I've created myself that I travel and teach as an instructor of the instructors.
And aside from that specific to law enforcement, do you have any training or expertise in general physical combat, fighting, or areas that aren't specifically law enforcement but still assist you in a presentation regarding use of force?
I started martial arts training when I was about 13 years old, and I became a semi-pro kickboxer. I was very lucky. I got to participate in the 80s in the ISK super fights and things. Actually, it was right here in Orlando. It was my first super fight that I was able to participate in. So I've always had an interest and involvement in physical combat. I grew up with 2 older brothers, so I got beat up a lot by my older brothers, and it just seemed like a reasonable thing to do for me to try to bring in that personal experience. So in the process of my own personal experiences with fighting, martial arts, kickboxing, training, I was actually training with Chris Anderson and Rico Brockington, who were at the time in the late 80s, they were both championship fighters, boxers. And I had the opportunity to train with them and to learn from them when I was attending my kickboxing schools. And I just continued on. Currently, I'm involved with a martial arts organization, and I've been given the privilege of developing and working with them in developing firearms related to martial arts, where it's a component, because a lot of people think of the samurai with the swords, which is very accurate, but believe it or not, toward the end of the samurai's era, they actually were using firearms. And it's a lot of things about the history of fighting that people don't know. And I'm blessed to work with a gentleman by the name of Dennis Ritchie that runs an organization dedicated to the traditional aspects, and he's trying to bring in all these components so that people can learn safety through martial arts training, the peace, the mind, the essence of the spirit, and take it all the way through even the modern day weapon systems that people utilize today. And I've been blessed with the opportunity to participate with that.
Ever take the opportunity to even the score with your brothers?
I did, but it was very young, and I lost. And I got blessed enough that as I became a police officer, my brother's also a retired police officer, but through our transitions in my schooling, he started to realize, I think, that it was better just to leave me alone. So at some point, the tables turned. I could just, I like to just think that he knew better. I don't know that he did, but I like to think that he did.
That's good. And during all this time with Martin County, you completed your law enforcement career with Martin County, correct?
Yes, I retired in April of 2011.
During the last few years of your tenure with Martin County, can you advise the jury sort of even more what your focus was on assisting the county, the sheriff's office, in dealing with their use of force events?
In the latter portions of my career, I became involved with the sheriff's office for, just like I already said, all the force training. I maintained that all the way to the very last day. Matter of fact, even after retiring, I was offered the opportunity with Sheriff Crowder to continue training with the agency, and I had accepted that opportunity to do so. And during that time, I had permission from the sheriff's office to start my training company, where I started doing law enforcement training and eventually individual, or what we refer to as civilian training.
And during that time, particularly the last few years with Martin County, did that include opportunities for you to review use of force events and to either testify in someone's behalf or to deal with the administrative side of a use of force event?
Because of the area, we're blessed that we don't have a lot over the careers of shootings, but we have had our fair share. Toward the end of my tenure with the Sheriff's Office, as a use of force specialist, I was approached by the state to testify, to review, and provide an opinion for grand jury on use of force events involving police-involved shootings that ended up in the death of the subject being shot. I was also brought in by our agency at the Martin County Sheriff's Office when we had organizational involved shootings, that there were times where I was brought into administrative meetings to meet with the attorneys group to do an evaluation of the use of force to determine whether or not I had considered that event at that time to be reasonable or not, and to provide input as to why it was or was not. So I kind of helped the attorneys group for the Sheriff's Office representing them and forming an idea as to what actually took place, and I was also given the opportunity for the state to do the same thing for grand juries.
And if you would, just tell us a little bit more about the experience that you've had with your presentation to grand juries. What would you take on? What was your role, and what would you present? Obviously, we know that any particular testimony in front of a grand jury in and of itself would be confidential. So I'm not going to ask for specifics, but generally or generically, what would you do?
Essentially what happens with a grand jury is I would be given all of the evidence. I'd be given a copy of all the written reports, any radio transmission CDs of any videos, photographs, crime scene photos, everything. I would be given the opportunity to review all of the evidence, because as the use of force expert, your job is to evaluate it from every perspective possible. You can't just walk into an event, look at it, and say, okay, that's how it worked, because nothing works that way. Every single person sees things differently. So I would get all of the evidence. I would be given an opportunity to review all of the evidence, formulate opinions based on my background, training, and experience as to how I thought it went, provide an opinion as to whether I thought whatever was done was either considered to be objectively reasonable or was considered not to be objectively reasonable. Then what would happen is at a grand jury they would call all the witnesses in, and I would come in and the state would ask for my opinion, and I provided it to the grand jury of what my opinion was based on my background, training, and experience as to whether I thought what A, B, and C was it objectively reasonable given the facts and circumstances known to me with all the evidence, or was it unreasonable?
On how many occasions did you have an opportunity to present such testimony to a grand jury?
I believe it was 6 different times.
May I approach the witness for a moment, Your Honor?
You may.
Review what's marked as our Exhibit R, and ask if you can identify that.
That's my curriculum vitae.
That was something you prepared both for other cases you've been involved in and for today.
Yes.
We'll present evidence if I might, Your Honor. I think there's no objection.
No objection?
Correct.
Okay, Defense Exhibit RR will come into evidence as Defense Exhibit 24.
And regarding your most recent testimony, concerning your testimony with the grand jury, we've had a discussion about what you will and will not testify to here today, correct?
Yes.
As far as your focus of the Zimmerman case. So let me ask you in that regard, how you and I first got together, or how you became a witness in this case.
I actually reached out to Mr. O'Mara when I saw the case unfolding, obviously like everyone else in the media. I had a unique interest in it because there was so much information being flooded to the media. I didn't know exactly what had happened, obviously, as no one does. And I reached out to him because I thought I had a unique perspective as to coming to a realistic conclusion on things. Being able to proffer and look at things and just render my background, training, and experience to him to see if it helped. My experience has been I wanted to ensure, and the most common question is, I reached out to a defense attorney as a police officer or a former police officer, and the truth is there are a lot of people that can do what I do. There's plenty of experts available. And I reached out to Mr. O'Mara because it was my belief that if I reviewed the material and felt that I could be of no assistance, I would not do anything to hinder the progression for anybody in this case whatsoever. But if it was something that I felt that I could help with, I went to the one party that if it was an opportunity to be of assistance, I knew that I would be able to do so. So I reached out to him and to see if he had interest in using my services.
Okay. And that then began the process where you and I began working together on this case?
Yes.
And if you would, just advise the jury, generally and if appropriate, but more specifically, what you would want available to you for review in a case like this, and then what you got in this particular case.
What I request is just like with the state and the grand juries, everything that I can. As a use of force expert, I have to look at it from as many perspectives as possible, because everybody's perspective is different. You have to take into consideration what their upbringing was, what their background was, where they lived, what their personal life experiences were and currently are. So my request is to obtain as much information as possible, get any witness statements that I can get, any photographs that I can get, all the evidence that's available, so that I can help see a complete picture and not just a picture that'll be guided from one direction or another. An expert's job is merely to look at everything and evaluate it in the totality of the circumstances, not skewed by one person's opinion or another person's opinion.
And in this case, then, what information did you request and what information was given?
Pretty much everything that I requested was provided. I can't think of anything that wasn't. I requested to be able to review the 911 calls. I requested to be able to review the reports from law enforcement, from the medical examiner's office, anything that was documented or written down, so that I could get an insight from not just the witnesses that provided statements, whether it be orally or in writing, but also from the investigators that were conducting it, so I could also look at the questions that were being asked to see. Sometimes you can think of a question you don't know, but then as you go through a different investigator, they thought of the question, so seeing all the investigators' reports was very important. I also requested any crime scene photos that were there to try to give me an idea of what the environment was like. And everything that I requested, I can't think of anything that I wasn't provided with for evaluation.
And realizing that you weren't here during the trial, I'm going to go over some quick overview of some of the information to make sure that the jury knows you may have had this specifically to the extent that they've heard testimony. So did you get witness statements that were produced pursuant to law enforcement request?
Yes, I received the written witness statements, and I also had the witness statements from the interviews where they actually conducted the criminal investigation interview. And
on the occasions that deposition transcripts were available, did you receive those as well?
As far as I know, if they were available, I did get a chance to see them.
And did you receive all the entirety of the police, if you will, police file or the investigative file that's prepared in this case?
To the best of my knowledge, I've gotten everything. Of course, you don't know what you don't know, but I believe I've received everything.
And I think you mentioned that you were able to review, for purposes of your testimony today, the autopsy itself concerning the injuries to Mr. Martin?
Yes.
And pictures of Mr. Martin and Mr. Zimmerman?
Yes.
You have an opportunity to review any of the scene mock-ups or drawings that were created either by the state or defense in this case?
The only scene drawings that I saw from what I received were from the investigators. I didn't see any. You mentioned a state mock-up. I didn't see a state mock-up.
If I might approach for a moment, Your Honor. As an example, this is in evidence as states 139, just to see if this is just that. Did you see something, a much smaller version of this?
Yes, sir. I did.
And on 140, another sort of similar mock-up with the same thing. Have you seen that?
Yes, sir.
When I say mock-up, I was speaking of something
I
like that.
apologize. Yes, I've seen those.
My mistake, not yours. did you also have an opportunity to review video and audio and written statements from Mr. Zimmerman?
Yes, I did.
To your knowledge, and I know that you don't know what you don't know, but did you get the entirety of the information that you requested?
As far as I know, I got everything that I was looking for.
Was there anything that you asked to get from us that we said we don't want you to have, or that we just didn't give you?
No, quite the contrary. Some things came up during the deposition that apparently you didn't know I didn't have, and I was given it immediately.
And that may have been just some of the witness statements or some other pieces of evidence that Mr. Guy during your deposition had questioned you about?
Yes, one that I'm referring to specifically was a TV interview. I had either not seen it in the materials or something, and when Mr. Guy asked me about it, I wasn't aware of it, but since then I have viewed it.
Are we speaking now about the Sean Hannity interview?
Yes, sir.
For your purposes, understand that that's in evidence now. The jury has reviewed that. So as you incorporate that into your testimony, be aware that they know what it is you're talking about.
Okay.
Did you get enough information in this case from which you could review the available information to focus your opinion regarding the events that happened that night?
Yes.
In the overall scheme of cases and comparing the information available to you in this case to others that you reviewed, is this less than you normally review, average, or more than you normally get a chance to review?
I would say this is average for the significance of this issue. I think that there was a lot of material, but it's on average when you deal with an event of any similar nature, you're going to get a lot of data.
We've had other experts testify, and within that context, they narrow their focus to their area of expertise, and I would ask you to do the same. So if you could sort of lay the foundation for the jury, when you're looking through all of this information, all of the witness statements, all of the pictures, all of whatever it is, what filter are you using to focus the information that's relevant for you and your opinion?
Well, I focus everything based on background, training, experience, knowledge of, in individual or civilian realm, knowledge of the law, and all of the information. I focus it based on the totality of the circumstances known to me, and I bring in my background, training, and experience, both for law enforcement and individual. Because one of the things we didn't talk about for my background is my training company is, I now primarily do individual type training, firearms training, self-defense classes for children, adults, and seniors. So I take all of that background training and experience, and that's what I use to filter out the information. And I couple it, obviously, with over 20 years of law enforcement experience in evaluating information that's been presented and understanding how things may be affected by other people.
And was that then done in this case?
Absolutely.
So what information that you had available to you assisted, well, let me back up. Was your focus of your investigation of this case, in your opinion, based upon the event specifically surrounding the intersection of Mr. Zimmerman and Mr. Martin that night?
That was the primary focus area.
And the altercation that ensued and the eventual shooting?
Correct.
Okay. So if you would then, with that, I guess, as your filter, walk the jury through what information you looked at and then found relevant to assist you in formulating your opinions.
Well, the first thing that I utilize is the initial statements, the initial calls that come in. It's really important to establish a timeline for events. A timeline is very important because it helps you understand and compartmentalize information to the best of your ability, because as with any issue, perspectives are skewed. So what some people may see or hear another person may not doesn't mean that they didn't witness something or that they didn't know something. It just may not be from the same perspective as another witness. So the first thing that I looked at and listened to were the 911 calls that came in. Then I added to that the initial interviews of the key witnesses, I use the word key witnesses, the people with the most information that saw or heard the most that could be relied upon. And I
Excuse me
used,
if I might, I'm sorry.
yes,
Just so you're aware, I know that in depositions and prior conversations with you and I and the state and you, the identity of certain witnesses was kept confidential. We were using witness names, and I think I said half a dozen times to you not to ever mention the witnesses by name. That restriction has been relaxed. Those witnesses' names are now available to the jury. So to the extent, I withdraw my request of you earlier.
Okay.
So to the extent that it is relevant for you to identify them by name, you may have trained yourself to just use numbers, that's okay as well, but to the extent that you can utilize the names, it would be helpful for the jury to know particularly which witness is you talked to or talked about or read about.
okay, that does help a little bit. I reviewed all of them, and forgive me if I don't pronounce all their names correctly because some of the names are very difficult. Statements from Ms. Lauer, Mr. Good, the Bahadors. I listened to every audio recording from the 911 calls that came in as well as from the witnesses. And I tried to filter through what each witness said and compare it to where on a timeline it could fall. You know, for example, just as a brief example, if somebody said that their attention was called to the event because they heard screaming, well, that tells me within the timeline that certain things had already taken place because when the screaming started. So you have to look at it and try the best you can to filter in the information. And then you take into consideration witnesses that actually, like Mr. Good, who actually stepped out and had a time where he interacted from a distance with the participants. I used all of that information to begin forming my opinions and to focus in my energies on evaluating what I thought may have taken place.
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's fine.
As to the witnesses that you viewed, the statements and the information they presented to you, based upon your training and experience, 20 years worth or more as law enforcement, how do you view witness statements and whether or not you can guarantee accuracy or not?
I look at it, it's very fluid. Accuracy is based on perspective. I'm a movie fanatic, so there was this movie by Dennis Quaid for Vantage Point, and it showed one singular event from like 8 different perspectives. That's the reality of most encounter every single person has, is we all have our vantage point. We all have our perspective. So as I begin to listen to the statements that are being made, when I said I listened to the 911 calls and then the initial interviews, one of the best things about the initial interviews as a person evaluating an event is the fact that you're usually getting the most raw information. In other words, that's the most immediate access information from their brain right there without any other stimulus or influence of any type. One of the first things that we do as investigators is separate witnesses, because everybody that talks, I may say that, if I can use Mr. O'Meara, is wearing a pink shirt, and you only see it for a quick second, and you thought it was like an orange shirt, and I'm wrong and you're right. If I'm strong enough in my conviction, you may sway to my perception. So when I look at it and I listen to and I evaluate what was said, I really try to go back to the original statements that were made before there could have been any other outside variable or influence, because those usually are the most raw. They may not always be the most complete, but they're the essential elements of what a person witnesses, because they're usually the ones that strike the deepest inside a person's mind. So when I begin to review information, I listen to the calls, then I go to that initial interview. If they have a subsequent interview, which in these cases there were other interviews at other times, you can see things change a little bit. And one of the most important things is to remember, again, perspective. I have a thing that I call the hot pot theory. Hot pot theory. The idea behind it is about perspective. And when I teach classes, I explain that if I took a pot and I placed it in the freezer and it got ice cold. And I took it out and I placed it on your stove. And you came in and I asked you to pick up the pot and move it for me. The moment you make contact with the pot and you feel that complete change in temperature, you're instinctually letting go and moving away. And then most people, not all, but most people will test the water to see, because their brain took into account the environment, the event, what they perceive, what is a pot when it's on a stove usually. It's very hot. When they touch it and feel that sudden change in temperature, their perception was, even though it wasn't, it was very hot because of all the external influences. So when I look at and evaluate statements being given, what I try to do is put myself into that person's shoes the first time they spoke. What did they see? What did they hear? What can they remember before they have any of the other influences? Because remember, even under that high-stress event, they're still having influences, whether it's dark, the lighting, raining, whatever the case is. There's environmental influences. If they just had a discussion with a loved one that didn't go well, that's going to influence their perceptions. So you try to look at it from their perspective and merge, if you will, their perspective with the perspective of another, and the perspective of another, coupled with physical evidence and things like that, until you arrive at what you deem to be a logical conclusion.
So in your experience, then, if you run into a situation where there are conflicting statements about the same event, is that an understandable occurrence to you, or is that evidence deceit, or how do you resolve that?
Conflicting statements are normal. They're also very normal from the people involved in the event. Something to remember about high-stress events. A high-stress event can be something like somebody driving down the road and a car coming across their lane when they didn't expect it. That was a very stressful event. Certain things happen inside the human body. I do training classes for the psychological and physiological aspects and effects of stress on a person during combat. People that witness horrendous events go through a similar emotional response. So you have to look at it and understand that there are going to be deviations in statements because of perspective, stress. Some people don't want to acknowledge some things because there are some people that want, honestly, to live in a bubble, and their perspective is based on they don't want to accept that certain things happen. So when I look at it and I get statements, if they're conflicting, you look at the essence of the statements and you try not to get hung up, if you will, on small changes. Now, if their entire statement changes, that creates a completely different animal. But when you talk about a person who has just a slight deviation, you look at it in the context in which it was presented and see if maybe there's been another variable that caused that deviation. As far as a deviation from witness to witness immediately following an event, again, that's just based on perspective. There's always going to be those variances.
So we had an opportunity to review, as you mentioned, the witness statements in this event. I focus you on Ms. Sudaiker's event. You have an opportunity to see that or review that statement.
Mr. Diker?
Ms. Sudaiker,
Oh, Sudaika.
the woman who thought that she heard maybe three
No,
shots.
I'm sorry. I need to interpose an objection as to improperly asking this witness to comment on another witness.
I'm not seeking for impeachment, Your Honor. I'm actually seeking to explain.
Well, I'll listen to your next question then.
Okay. You read Ms. Sudaiker's statement where she suggested that she thought she heard 3 shots?
Yes.
Okay. Did that give you any cause for concern, or is that just a perception issue that you just fit into the rest of your evaluation?
The same objection as his commenting on a witness, the testimony of another witness.
My response, but I want to speak the
Okay,
objection.
well then approach.